May 12, 1828, a young man receives a spiritual revelation. His name was Nat Turner. It was his third vision. He later confessed at his trial, "I heard a loud noise in the heavens, and on the appearance of the sign, I should arise and prepare myself and slay my enemies with their own weapons." 3 years later, there was an eclipse, and the sun appeared blue. He took this as a sign and confided in 4 men he trusted the most. They began planning their strategies and decided to press on to Dismal Swamp, 30 miles to the east, where getting captured would be difficult. They would also capture the armory at the county seat. Back, a slave of Hannah Williamson states that Nicholas and Booker say that they would join the Negroes to murder the white people, and heard the prisoner Solomon say that he would join too. For the white people, they had been reigning long enough. The new goal was to find the proper date, which would be decided after another sign.
On October 2, 1800, Turner was born on the property of a prosperous small plantation owner in Southampton County, Virginia. He was transferred between several houses, which was the reality for many slaves. He learned to read from one of his master's sons, and he eagerly absorbed intensive religious training. His religious ardor approached fanaticism, and his powerful influence to nearby slaves led him to be called the prophet. One slave described Turner as a deeply religious man who studiously avoided mixing in society and wrapped himself in mystery, devoting time to fasting and praying. At one point, Turner had a vision from God and ran away.
Slavery in America started in early 17th century. By 1804, all northern states abolished slavery, but peculiar institution of slavery still persisted in the South. In 1808, African slave trade was outlawed by the U.S. Congress, but the domestic trade flourished. By the time of this rebellion, slaves made up almost half the population of Southampton County. Frederick Douglass, an escaped slave, provides an inside view on slavery in the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. He begins his narrative by admitting that, by far, the larger part of slaves know as little of their ages as horses know of theirs. Douglass implies that the enslaved people were dehumanized and deprived of basic human rights. Douglass spotlights how enslaved people were abused both physically and psychologically by describing how they felt after witnessing his master whip a woman to make her scream and whip her to make her hush. Douglass describes that when a white man killed someone else's slave, he would see whether to pay him for his property or to justify himself in what he had done. This emphasizes how slaves were treated like properties rather than human beings. This picture on the right is a slave auction house in Alexandria that was used as a large domestic slave trade market.
Back to 1831, Turner and 6 of his men set out to the Travis household, where they killed the entire family as they lay sleeping. They continued from house to house, killing all the white people they encountered. His campaign of total annihilation continued, and in 2 days and nights, about 60 white people were ruthlessly slain. His insurrection was disabled as his force of 75 people became undisciplined and unorganized. They were stopped by a force that consisted of 3,000 men, consisting of the state militia and local whites. Some rebels were captured, 1 was killed, and the rest escaped, including Turner.
This slave rebellion carried bloody consequences. Rebels, as well as their family, friends, and neighbors, were beaten and killed. Dozens of slaves stood trial for their participation in the rebellion. While some were acquitted, more than 50 were convicted and sentenced to death by a collection of 20 judges, which were all slaveholders. In addition, revenge-minded white mobs lynched blacks who played no part in the uprising. Close to 200 black people that had nothing to do with the rebellion were murdered by white mobs. In some cases, slaveholders placed bloodied and dismembered bodies in public view to remind passersby of their awful power. 2 months later, Turner was found and surrendered. Turner was brought to Jerusalem, where he was interviewed by 2 of the most prominent political figures in Southampton, James Tresvant and James W. Parker. A witness found Turner quite communicative. Turner's willingness to answer any questions created an opportunity for Thomas R. Gray to publish Turner's confession. 6 days after his capture, he stood trial and was convicted of conspiring to rebel and making insurrection. Sentenced to death, Nat Turner was hung from a tree on November 11, 1831. Alexandria Phoenix Gazette newspaper reported that Turner was perhaps led by some hallucination of his imagined spirit of prophecy. It'll be long before the people of this county can get over the horrors of the late scenes or feel safe in their homes. It is an aggravation of the crimes perpetrated that owners of slaves in this country are distinguished for lenity and humanity. This quote truly spotlights the perspective that white slaveholders had on slavery. While it is true that Turner's rebellion was horrific and devastating, the newspaper fails to acknowledge the motive of this massacre, which was to avenge the years of mental and physical abuse. The Richmond Require compared the rebels to a parcel of bloodthirsty wolves rushing down the Alps, or rather like a former insurgent of the Indians upon the white settlements. Not only does this show the animalistic view people had on slaves by comparing them to wolves, it also demonstrates how whites regarded Native Americans and blacks as equally being subhuman. Turner learns a lesson from this rebellion and states that no black man ought to be permitted to turn a preacher throughout the country.
According to historian David Walbert, Nat Turner's rebellion was one of the largest slave rebellions ever to take place in the United States, and it played an important role in the development of antebellum slave society. Initially, the rebellion caused an even greater imbalance of power between the whites and the blacks. The state legislature of Virginia considered abolishing slavery, but in a close vote decided to retain it to support a repressive policy against black people. At the Virginia General Assembly of 1831, many statesmen advocated to abolish slavery and support Jefferson's ideas. However, a majority championed further penalizing blacks, and they ended up prohibiting the education movement and assembly of slaves. However, while laws were put in place to suppress the slaves, both groups knew that slaves would not tolerate this treatment any longer, which Turner's rebellion made evident. The rebellion also caused the whole nation to open their eyes to the fact that slaves could fight back in a devastating way, so action towards fixing this conflict had to be resolved. The South wanted to put down the slave power, hoping to take enough hope from them that slaves would not dare to go against them. The North, however, wanted to soften the conflict by incorporating blacks into society, which was what they had already done. Although Turner's rebellion did not reach every part of the world, it showed that people who are being suppressed can seize power, even if it is temporary. Although this event was bloody, violent, and cruel, some might argue that it was a step in the right direction for the United States to become more united.